Mr. President, I have 7 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and the minority.
Duly noted.
And, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Stephen Davies, a Coast Guard Fellow, and Paul Bankston, a military fellow in the office of Senator Thad Cochran, be granted floor privileges for the remainder of the year.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm going to talk about something that's different than anyone else has talked about here, but there's a very good reason for it. First of all, to try to establish some credibility here, I've had occasion to spend quite a bit of time working on issues in Africa. In fact, I've had occasion over the last 23 years to make 156 African country visits. That's a lot of African country visits. And we have friends there. I personally have friends there, intimate friends. We've worked on a lot of the military concerns that they have, but this is an area where we have very close friends. And so I'm going to be singling out one close friend, but not to the detriment of the rest of them, because we have many close friends, certainly as many as 32 country presidents and prime ministers that we've been very close to. But there's a reason for singling out one particular individual, which is Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda. And the 2 reasons are, first of all, he's going to be coming in as the chairman or president of the African Union in the next few months. He has been already elected. The second thing is that he has survived the Rwanda genocide, which arguably could be the greatest genocide of all times. And on the 28th of January, he will become the president and chairman, I guess, of the African Union. Now, this is really nothing short of a miracle. Rwanda is a miracle, and we have Paul Kagame and the people of Rwanda to thank for it. In 1994, one of the most atrocious genocides ever perpetrated occurred in this small East African country. For a period of about 100 days, nearly 1 million Rwandans were slaughtered. As is always the case, the seeds of genocide were planted many decades before, but when it finally started in April of 1994, many thousands of Hutus used machetes and clubs to slaughter Tutsis. Now, those are 2 tribes that people are very familiar with. Now, in most cases, it was neighbors killing neighbors, even some family members. The horror was just unimaginable. Fathers and mothers were forced to watch their children being hacked to death. One man was forced to beat his wife to death in order to spare their 7 children from being tortured to death. Many Rwandans who were lucky enough to survive and remember watching their parents and siblings being murdered. One person, in fact, this would be this is kind of a last-minute thought, but there's one individual that was her name is Immaculée. She wrote a book, and the name of the book was Left to Tell. And that's something that you can really get an idea of what happened. The fact that there are people in their own community trying to kill her, and they killed 70% of the entire tribe at that time. Well, anyway, the world just watched as this slaughter took place. They did nothing, despite having the United Nations had peacekeepers stationed in Rwanda, and they were ordered to withdraw and leave all the genocide to take place. Our president, U.S. president, was Bill Clinton. He did nothing. The world just stood by and watched. And the horror was stopped only because of one man. That one man was Paul Kagame. In October of 1990, Paul Kagame led a group of young Rwandan refugees from Uganda whose parents had fled the country's mass violence 3 decades before. Now, you have to keep in mind that Uganda, the president there is President Museveni. President Museveni and President Paul Kagame both actually came from the bush. They were good friends, and he went up there for refuge to try to save his Rwandans at that time because he saw the genocide coming. And what's even more amazing about Rwanda is their leader and what happened after this. You see, Rwanda had 2 very different paths it could have taken. They could have either just taken revenge. Paul Kagame could take the strength that he had, the new power that he had, and he could go after the other tribe that was there, the Hutus, and he could start another genocide of his own, That could have happened. The other thing he could have done was the path of forgiveness and reconciliation. And this is the path of hard work, where the Tutsis who survived the genocide would have to learn how to forgive and live alongside the same Hutus who killed their family members. This is the path of rebuilding a nation from the ground up so that together they could have a common future. We now know which path Rwanda chose. President Kagame led them down the path of reconciliation. There are a lot of people who helped make this happen. One of the individuals I happen to personally be very fond of, he's deceased now, but it was Chuck Colson. You remember him, and he was spent time in prison. He started the prison fellowship and was very actively involved in the program, the reconciliation process. In many cases, the Hutus who committed genocide against a Tutsi family would seek forgiveness from that family and then achieve reconciliation by building a home together for the Tutsi survivors who lived in. So through this, it may seem kind of like a small gesture, but the people, it allowed the healing and forgiveness process to work. Together, the Hutus and the Tutsis are rebuilding their nation as Rwandans working together. And I had one experience that I watched them shortly after this happened. My wife called this to my attention. We had a bunch of the Hutus and the Tutsi women that were working. They have, in Rwanda, they build a certain kind of a basket that's different from any other country. And so after the reconciliation, there they were, the Hutu and the Tutsi young women were making these, and then the ingenious of Paul Kagame, he worked out a deal with several department marketing areas in the United States. Macy's is one of them, and they started selling this stuff. And so it was a great boon for them. But anyway, he should be credited, Paul Kagame, for this amazing transformation of a nation divided of hate to a thriving, successful country. And this transformation is paying great dividends. I was in Rwanda most recently in October, and I've been there a total of 8 times in the last few years. Each time I go, I'm surprised by what I see. Let me just mention 5 things that are unique to Rwanda. First, there's not a piece of litter anywhere in Rwanda. I mean, just people can't believe they're anywhere in Africa or any other country, United States. There's nothing. You can't find any litter. In fact, they have at the last Saturday of every month, they have a program where they go through and everybody joins together and they pick up every kind of bit of trash and everything else. That didn't sound like very much, but you sure notice the difference when you're there. The second thing that is different about them is their infrastructure. Rwanda is known as the land of 1,000 hills. They don't have any level areas in Rwanda. And I remember not long ago going for an hour and a half in the area between the hill area and the mountain area, and on a road that was paved, perfectly paved. I mean, it's one that you would expect to be in the United States. There were no potholes, nothing, but it was a highway that you'd expect to find anywhere except in Africa. And they are known for this, because Rwanda is different. The third thing is the people are hard workers. I mentioned that there aren't any flat areas out there, so every square foot in Rwanda is used to grow something, from the bottoms of the peaks. I mean, everything is there. They're hard workers, and they grow all the things that they grow: tea, coffee, potatoes, other crops. They're all being cultivated across the entire country, and it's all hilly country. There's no place else that's actually what is taking place. And it's hard work. They do it mostly by hand, but because this is hard work, they're able to feed themselves and export more valuable crops abroad. And fourth, it's safe. You wouldn't expect a country that's gone through the most devastating genocide, maybe in history, to be a safe place to walk around, and it is. There's things that are happening. You can walk there at nighttime, and I'll tell you, it's safer than Washington, D.C. The fifth thing that's unusual about this, the economy is booming. Everywhere you look in Rwanda, construction is happening. It's in just the last few years, they built new hotels, a convention center, and they're now working on a new airport to facilitate all the growth in tourism that's coming there. And these are just my observations, but President Kagame's leadership is not just resulting in visible changes. The numbers back up what I've seen. Since he became president in 2000, Rwanda has experienced a GDP real growth of 8%. Now, this is kind of interesting because here we are, through our tax bill, we're going to be increasing our GDP here in this country, and there's a formula that no one disagrees with, and that is that for each 1% increase in growth in the GDP, that develops $1 trillion over a period of 10 years of increased revenue. And that's some of the revenue that we're going to be using as a result of that. But this is not United States. This is in Africa, an 8% GDP growth. And it's geared toward the poor people. And that's why the population is just lifted people out of poverty. It has dramatically improved its ease of doing business. The World Bank recently ranked Rwanda #1 for doing business in East Africa, #2 for doing business in Sub-Saharan Africa, and #41 in the world. Now that's remarkable when you consider that just a matter of 8 years before, they were ranked 150th in the world for doing business. Now they're 41. And today you can start a business and get all the necessary permits to operate in just a few days. Rwanda has become a model for gender empowerment. Maybe this is going a little further than a lot of the people in this country are comfortable with, but Rwanda's constitution requires that 30% of decision-making positions be awarded to women. But today, because of Obama, it's now 60%. 60% of Rwanda's parliamentarians and 40% of its cabinets are filled by women, including my good friend, the foreign minister, Louise Mushikiwabo, and also the ambassador that many of us know here because she's here in the United States, Ambassador Matilda. The fourth thing is Rwanda has facilitated the development of technology that no one would expect in Africa. Rwanda enjoys a nationwide fiber optic infrastructure that will ensure 95% of its citizens have access to high-speed 4G internet. Further, it has integrated a drone technology into its healthcare system to ensure that different things like blood can reach patients all over the country. And the fifth thing is that Rwanda has transformed its healthcare system. Life expectancy is now 64.5%. In 2000, it was just 49%. All that's taken place just in the last few years. Child mortality rates are down more than 2/3. Maternal mortality is down 80%. In 2000, there was only one doctor for every 66,000 people. Today, there's one doctor for every 10,000 people. When asked, in between those years, since the genocide has taken place, the malaria-related deaths plummeted by 85%. And when you ask how these things were possible, the World Health Organization's country director said, and this is a quote, this is not a quote by me or someone in this country or by the president. The quote is, the main ingredient is visionary leadership. This is the World Health Organization speaking. It's about having a target, saying we want to be there in the future, and understanding the obstacles in the way. That visionary leader is Paul Kagame, and he gets results. That's the World Health Organization. Rwanda has established a highly capable professional military. President Kagame actually studied in Fort Leavenworth in Kansas as a part of the IMET program in the early 1900s. The IMET program is a program where we train people from different countries to be leaders there. And of course, they develop an allegiance to our country. It's very successful. That's how this guy got started. He started in an IMET program. His military background is very professional. As president, he's acquired the same of his forces. In the Rwanda Defense Forces, all military orders and instructions are issued through a chain of command. Rwanda's plan is to have a small, well-equipped army of 20,000 with a reserve component of 100,000. Their defense strategy is to sustain a combat-ready force capable of rapidly deploying to meet varying contingencies both at home and abroad. And they're delivering. Rwanda is the 5th largest contributor to the UN peacekeeping operations in the world. They currently have close to 5,000 troops deployed in different missions, widely acknowledged as some of the best performing and most trusted peacekeepers in the world. Rwanda is also a major participant in the Eastern African Standby Force. That's a battalion of 850 troops and a police contingency of 140 officers, which are on standby for contingencies in East Africa. And the countries that have gone together are Tanzania, Uganda, Burundi, Kenya, and of course, Rwanda. These are the kinds of things that are exactly in line with what we should be helping them and participating in and doing ourselves here in the United States in terms of policy goals for AFRICOM. We set up a way to help Africans, to train and assist regional partners so that they will be capable of handling security threats before they become global crises. With the emergence of their peacekeeping mission, the regional cooperation, what we hoped would happen is happening. And Paul Kagame is the reason Rwanda is leading the way. Rwanda is a clear example of what a strong strategic partner should look like to the United States. It's not just me saying this. Rwanda is recognized around the world for its professional force. In fact, Rwanda's defense minister was among the few leaders who spoke at the United Nations Peacekeeping Ministerial in November in Vancouver. And because of these amazing accomplishments, President Kagame is widely viewed as one of the most influential heads of state in the continent of Africa. Now, a lot of leaders and observers praise him and his record. Benedict Orama, president of the African Export-Import Bank, said, and this is a quote, this is the African Export-Import Bank, he said, Rwanda, quote, Rwanda is a country that was all but written off some 2 decades ago. But just like the phoenix that died and rose from its ashes, it emerges to become the shiniest star on the continent. The shiniest in terms of governance, in terms of can-do spirit, doing those things that nobody ever thought was possible. Again, that's the African Export-Import Bank talking about Paul Kagame, the head of the World Health Organization. The African Department said, and this is the head of the African Department of the World Health Organization. He said, and this is a quote, I want to recognize Rwanda's remarkable leadership, its creativity, tenacity, and resolve, which have delivered significant progress in advancing health and development for the benefit of all your people. Your achievements in such a short space of time are truly remarkable. That's the World Health Organization. He's talking about Rwanda, and he's talking about specifically the President Kagame. Now, former Nigerian President Obasanjo, some of you may remember, Obasanjo came in after the person who is considered one of the great terrorists of all time. At that time was Sani Abacha. He came in to reform the leadership there in Nigeria. And his statement was, quote, Rwanda has made difficult trade-offs, but as an African leader, I tell you that I would make the same trade-offs. And yet his influence is recognized more clearly, not by what people have said about him, but by what his peers have asked him to do. In July of 2016, Kagame was selected by his peers to lead the effort to reform the African Union to make it more effective. He did not use this opportunity to raise his own profile, as most people would do. Rather, he used it to build consensus and cast a vision for a future Africa that is no longer reliant on aid from the outside world. This is really big. This is a very significant thing, because when you talk to people on the street about Africa and the things we do with Africa, the first thing they say is Africa is always having to be supported by us. We're pouring money into Africa, and they're not able to do things on their own. But this, when he says, this is the first time he made the statement, Africa is no longer reliant on aid from outside nations. Within months, he developed a reform package focused on 4 categories. This is significant. The first one is the African Union has got to be focused on key priorities with a continental scope as opposed to regional. This is something that has been happening for a long time, but they're moving from regional to start looking after their entire continent. He wants the AU focused on fewer but bigger issues that affect everyone on the continent. The second thing, the AU must connect with its citizens. Paul Kagame envisions doing this by establishing women and youth quotas that I just mentioned a minute ago across the institutions, and by identifying appropriate ways and means to ensure the private sector, parliament, civil society, and citizens are participating in the process. He also wants to make the Africa passport available to all citizens, allowing a free flow of people among the nation states. And the third thing, the business of the AU must be managed effectively and efficiently with accountability, called the Rwanda way. The fourth thing is to charge the member states with providing all the necessary funding to operate the African Union without assistance from outside donors. Now, have you ever heard that before from any country, leave alone Africa? But that's what he said. And he envisions doing this by each African country imposing a 0.2% tariff on eligible imports. Now, while not all observers agree, I admire this vision for seeking ways to ungrip themselves from the assistance of other nations to fund their government activities. So that was his plan. But what cements his status as an influential power broker in Africa is that at the AU's next meeting, January of, this is in the past now, but at their next meeting, which was January of 17, his peers at the AU, that's the African Union, affirmed the recommendation and charged him with actually implementing them. Once again, African leaders unanimously decided to trust Kagame. They chose him as the best leader to put reforms into action. And so far, a number of the proposals have already been implemented. About half of the nation states have already implemented the most difficult part. That is passing upon themselves a 0.2% import tariff and forwarding the procedures to the African Union. So they were paying for all these things that are happening, that are proposed by Kagame in the African Union. And so that they actually have what we call real skin in the game. More and more nations are getting on board, and Rwanda is leading the way. To further cement his standing and influence, in July of 17, Kagame was selected by his peers to chair the African Union in 2018, and here it is, 2018. So it's going to be happening. With genocide, Rwanda has a dark history, but because they chose the path of forgiveness and reconciliation, that instead of revenge, President Kagame has had and used his national platform to be an agent of friendship and reconciliation between nations that normally don't like each other, nations that normally are fighting against each other. So let's take another look at what he's actually done. First, he and the state of Israel have a similar past. Both have been victims of genocide. We all know that. Many African nations, about half of them, are Muslim-majority countries. President Kagame has used his influence in the region to facilitate Israel's desire to re-engage in Africa. So Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel referred to Rwanda as the indispensable bridge on which Israel marched to return to Africa. And in just the last 2 years, the Prime Minister Netanyahu has welcomed in several of the African capitals. I was with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I can tell you that he was one that was so impressed with the work that has been done by Paul Kagame, so that he is able to invest himself in that continent of Africa, which he's never able to do before. At the United Nations, Rwanda has put itself at risk of widespread criticism in order to stand up for what is right. In 2014, Rwanda rotated onto a UN Security Council. While there, Rwanda abstained from an anti-Israel resolution so typical of the United Nations. They're always against Israel. And when he did this, they blocked it from moving forward, preventing the United States from having to veto it. Now, in this chamber, we remember that. I can remember the fact that we didn't want to be in the position to veto it, but what they were doing was totally unfair, and we had one guy who's courageous enough to do it. That was Paul Kagame from Rwanda. More recently, Rwanda is one of the few nations not to vote against the United States for condemning our decision to move our Israeli ambassador from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Rwanda is willing to take a stand for what's right. He keeps its word, doesn't shake with fear at the possibility of intimidation. Kagame has also brought about the restoration of broken relationships with Africa. In 2016, he led the push to invite Morocco back into the African Union. Now, this is an issue that a lot of people are concerned with, all the way back to the first Bush administration. Our Secretary of State at that time, Jim Baker, was trying his best to undo the damage that was done by Morocco to Western Sahara. 3 decades ago, Western Sahara was taken from its homeland and put out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. And I've been there several times, and you wonder how a person can live out there. And so anyway, the problem was that Morocco is very rich, Western Sahara is very poor. I testified before a House committee not too long ago, and I commented that Morocco has hired the most expensive lobbyists that are in Washington. So obviously he gets his way on things that other people don't. But anyway, one of the problems was that because of that advantage that they have, they've been not willing to come to the table. And one of the reasons is Morocco has been the only country that can be considered an African country that was not part of the African Union. So what Paul Kagame did, he brought him in as to the African Union. Now he's able to convince both the African Union and Morocco to allow Morocco to join so that they can once get together and get something done. So that hopefully he's on the road to trying to end 3 decades of trauma that's taken place out in the desert. But did this effort sour our relations with Kagame? No. In fact, the impact has been just the opposite. Earlier this month, the former General President Horst Kohler, the UN envoy for resolving the Western Sahara Morocco dispute, traveled to Kigali to appeal for Kagame's help to resolve the situation. The UN recognizes the important steps that Kagame has taken to bring Morocco into the African Union as an important step in resolving the problem really of Western Sahara. So it's not just Morocco where the Kagame has made a difference. Let's look at others. South Sudan is another problem. Sudan and South Sudan were the same country. And finally, South Sudan has been trying to gain its independence. They finally did gain their independence, and we thought everything would be fine when that happened. Unfortunately, that started a civil war in South Sudan. So this is something that has been going on now for 3 years, and we know that the only person that looks like he's really deep in has a resolve to resolve the conflict as well. So Rwanda has peacekeeping troops in both countries. And the Sudanese and the South Sudanese forces do not target, but they protect Rwanda. So you have 2 countries that are warring against each other. You have Rwanda going in to try to resolve it, and they both welcome Rwanda. And they trust Rwanda's military because they trust Kagame. So it's tempting to think that Rwanda is a small country in the middle of nowhere that does not have a lot of influence, but that would be a mistake because of the results Kagame has been able to secure for his people and because of the personal relationships that he's developed. Rwanda is among the most influential countries in Africa. Consider the fact that when Kagame was inaugurated to his 3rd term, no fewer than 22 heads of state from across Africa attended the festivities. Now, that's never been done before, when 22 countries come in to participate in the inauguration of a president. But they came for Paul Kagame. The leaders of African nations who normally fight with each other were actually seen embracing one another live on TV. And that just doesn't happen for no reason. It happens because they all trust and admire Paul Kagame. With all this, it's no wonder that African leaders are increasingly looking to Rwanda and Kagame for vision of how to move forward into the future. According to one reporter, the Rwanda model is becoming a hallmark phrase in Africa. Simon Allison writes, and this is a quote, he says, "In Africa's corridors of power, in the boardrooms of the banks, in closed-door cabinet meetings, in donor discussions, in interminable government conferences, it is repeated like a mantra, the Rwanda model, the Rwanda model. Kagame is advancing the vision of Africa leadership that's no longer reliant upon the aid of outsiders, totally reversing that. He wants to move his country and the whole continent away from dependence on foreign aid into bustling free market economies that enable the people to take care of themselves. In fact, he recently complained to his fellow peers at an African Security Summit meeting that they have relied too much on the international community to deal with their problems. This is a quote that he made. He said, "A major pillar of institutional reform of the AU is a more focused and assertive Africa that is focused on resolving its own problems." He said, "We must take responsibility for ourselves," which doesn't really exclude partners, but they add to our efforts. So he has clearly done that, and this is the main thing of all the reforms that he's talking about, is to get Africa out of that dependency mode, and he's actually doing it. Last March, while speaking in London at the Wall Street Journal's Investing in Africa conference, Kagame said, quote, "I want to see Africa get its act together so that it is not reliant upon Western intervention in its affairs." Same thing over and over again. He sees a future Africa that is more autonomous and capable of taking care of itself and taking care of its problems. It's kind of a vision that his peers are gathering around, but we shouldn't misunderstand it. Kagame's not saying that Africa should have no involvement in the United States or the West. Far from it. What he wants is to have a peer-to-peer relationship instead of a donor-based relationship. He wants legitimate business relations between customers and suppliers to join in together among African businesses and other international companies, including those in the United States. So, in Kagame's vision for a new Africa, African nations will have cooperation on security, anti-terrorism, and trade agreements with their friends, partners, and allies. He wants to end the days of reliance upon foreign governments to solve their problems. And so we see this again. Many leaders in Africa have desired this kind of a change, but few have had the position, the influence, the clarity, and focus to articulate it with the kind of passion that is as persuasive. Only Paul Kagame. And there are far fewer that have this kind of record of improving the lives of his own people in the way that he has. And this is exactly the kind of partnership that the United States should have with our friends and allies in Africa. Should have, but they don't have at the present time. For too long, the United States has had the wrong policy toward Africa, the African nations, and most Americans still think there's only one country on the continent of Africa rather than 54 independent states that make it up. U.S. policy toward Africa should be different. Our policy should be a partnership, approaching that focuses on helping Africans help Africans with three key components: security, trade, and diplomacy. In security, the United States security goals in Africa should be focused on training and equipping key partners to be capable of addressing regional and continental terrorist threats that could ultimately affect the United States, and addressing regional security threats that develop in regions so that the U.S. military does not have to engage, so they can do it instead of our involvement. This is the goal of AFRICOM. You know, AFRICOM is something fairly new because we once were a part of three different commands: the Central Command, the Pacific Command, and the European Command. Now we have AFRICOM as its own command. And it was designed for the express purpose, and we are increasingly meeting these goals and objectives. The second thing is trade. Our trade focus in Africa should be focused on developing free trade agreements with African nations so that they have a reciprocal peer relationship with our African trading partners. Fortunately, this is already the statutory policy of the United States, but it's not working that way. In 2015, a 10-year extension of the African Growth and Opportunity Act was signed into law. This is an appropriate policy for the near term, but long term, it's not, because we need to have the same kind of access to African nations as we provide to them. But in this law, it explicitly states that the policy of the United States is to pursue a free trade agreement with African nations. but it doesn't back it up with anything. In my travels of Africa, I've seen many countries are already, they're ready for free trade agreements, but the bureaucracies over here in the United States, they don't agree. They don't think that they are ready. So I introduced the African Free Trade Initiative Act, which does two things. First, it requires U.S. trade representatives to articulate what African countries need to do to get ready for trade agreements with the United States. You know, it's one thing for people over here, or people who are desiring trade and not desiring trade, to say, well, Africa is not ready. But what we're doing with this legislation is saying we need to know from our trade representative what they need to do so they can be a part, they can get skin in their own game. Second, it requires the United States Trade Representative to coordinate with the Millennium Challenge Corporation and USAID so that their aid dollars are focused on projects that will help prepare them for free trade agreements with us. Now, these provisions have passed and signed into law, so we're making that headway. Still, the bureaucracies have all the tools that they need, but they aren't willing to use them because they don't take Africa seriously. They don't view them as peers. They look down on them because they're small, but this is a shame because the economies in Africa are growing faster than any other region in the world. And then there's diplomacy. Our diplomatic focus in Africa should be focused on building relationships and alignments with countries that we can trust, who share our values, and who help us influence the rest of the continent and the world to be favorable to the United States. For too long, we've ridden the high horse through Africa. We have been quick to chide them for the mistakes they've made, and we've been slow or completely negligent in recognizing their accomplishments. Take Rwanda as an example. I've already articulated the miracle that they've experienced, but when the people of Rwanda decided to amend their constitution to allow President Kagame to run for an additional term, the Obama administration condemned him. They publicly shamed Kagame for the country's actions and doubled down when he ran for re-election. That administration did not have a category for the democratic process that was different from ours. They just didn't have the category for a new nation needing help, and so they were not helpful to them. That administration also failed to recognize the amazing progress that Rwanda has made to improve their country and the health and education of their people, nor did they recognize the superb security assistance Rwanda provides in the region. And so our relationship with Rwanda was negatively impacted by the Obama administration. We have become known as a condescending and unreliable partner in Africa. If we do not catch up and change our approach, our friends will find new partners, and we would be left alone. It's no secret how engaged China is on the continent. I think we all know that. Every time you travel through Africa, they will say, well, the United States tells you what you need, but we build what you need. Now, they don't do it with African labor and all that, but they have a reason for doing this. They understand how important Africa is going to be in the coming decades, so they're treating African nations accordingly, as peers, as we should be doing it. China has surpassed the United States as Africa's largest trading partner. We've been their largest trading partner for many years, but now that's changed. China's taken over. They funded the construction of the African Union's headquarters in Ethiopia. Their aid dollars go toward projects that are actually needed, and the projects happen much faster than compared to ours. The United States is falling behind and at great risk. Between now and 2030, the economies of African nations are expected to grow by an average of 5% a year, meaning the total size of their economies will nearly double in that time. By 2025, the continent will have a combined GDP of over $2.5 trillion, and $1.4 trillion of that's more than half of that, will be consumer spending. Increasingly, Africa's growing middle class will continue to become highly attractive in the business world. By 2034, Africa is expected to have the world's largest working age population of 1.1 billion people, which could lead to a low-cost labor economic boom similar to what was experienced in East Asia after World War II. Our National Security Council has noted that these demographic and economic shifts will have enormous political consequences, and that Africa's role in world politics will dramatically change because of them. Implementing this policy will benefit our people. It will give us greater security. It will give us a stronger economy, and it will add to our influence in the world in the long run. And these things we need to do. We're not doing them now. And so I'm encouraging our administration to do it. We need to get these things, and to implement this policy effectively, we must cultivate critical relations of influence with our like-minded friends in Africa. In the Middle East, we have Israel. In Europe, we have Great Britain. In Africa, we have Rwanda and Paul Kagame. So it's time to catch up. President Paul Kagame will soon be sworn in as the chairman of the African Union. In him, we have a visionary leader who has accomplished great things for his country. He's also established himself as a highly influential figure among African heads of state because he has set a bold vision for the future of Africa that is autonomous, self-sufficient, and open for business. And this vision is 100% complementary to what the United States policy should be in Africa. In recognizing this, it's my hope that the Trump administration will embrace him and Rwanda as the American friends that they are. We need to bring Rwanda close so that we can work cooperatively with them to accomplish our shared goal. Rwanda and America are like-minded friends, and we should treat them accordingly. So let me conclude this with a personal story that expands a little bit on this. I had an experience in 2000. In 2000, I was called by a friend in Rwanda. His name was Charles Muragandi. He called up and he said, there's a program that I've been involved in, others have been involved in, where we encourage them to have, like we have here in the United States Senate, we have weekly prayer breakfasts every Wednesday, and we encourage them to do the same thing. And he called me up and he said, you know, we now have been doing this, and we would like to have our first national prayer breakfast in Rwanda. He said, will you come over and speak? And so I did. Well, 14 years later, this is quite a coincidence. 14 years later, in 2014, we were on another trip and planned to land in Burundi before going to Ethiopia. But then, for security reasons, we weren't able to land in Burundi, so we stopped in Rwanda instead, and without any warning. Now, keep in mind, Rwanda didn't know we were going to be there. We didn't know we were going to be there. It was just completely, there's no warning whatsoever. But when we got there, as a coincidence, the next day they were having their 14th annual prayer breakfast. And they assumed, since I was their speaker at their first prayer breakfast 14 years before, I was there to give a speech. And so I did. But I say this because Paul Kagame, 14 years before that happened, and every year since then, and then every year since this took place, was then leading both prayer breakfasts. So in addition to all of the virtues of Paul Kagame that I've been talking about, perhaps too long, he's a strong man of faith. And it doesn't get any better than that, Mr. President. I yield the floor.